What I want to do right now is simply to present some highlights from the first chapter of the review, which sets the scene, looks at broad trends, and identifies what we see as perhaps the central challenges confronting the region. Those of you who were in Kristianstad yesterday, I apologize. I'll try to make this a bit different, but honestly, some of you probably will be lip syncing as I go through this because you heard it just 24 hours ago in many cases. First thing you heard yesterday, and you hear it again today, is a tremendous word of thanks to everybody in Skåne who has helped us, particularly the local team led by Gunnar Arnesen-Lufgren and Annika Attervall. If this review has any value to you at all, a lot of that actually is value that was added by the local team, by the people who supported them, by everybody who met us in successive missions as we came back to the region, meeting with public sector actors, experts, private sector actors. And we thank you for that. We're still responsible for any of the errors, omissions in the report. The aims of the review, ultimately we hope to give you a pretty good picture of Skåne from without, particularly in a comparative context. And I stress that context because everyone in this room knows more about Skåne than we do. Even at the end of this process, we're well aware of that. But hopefully we can help you see yourselves a bit differently because we come at it from having worked in many different countries and regions. And in the end, we hope to be able to give you some useful recommendations for the future. Now, quick look at past performance. One of the things I always start with growth and productivity because I'm an economist. And although productivity isn't everything, it's almost everything as far as I'm concerned. So we start with the growth and productivity picture today. And the point I want to make here, this slide shows you the contributions of various regions to aggregate growth of the economy and their relative weight in the economy just over a decade ago in 2000. So that 45-degree line, if you're sitting on that 45-degree line, your contribution is more or less exactly proportional to your size. If you're above it, you're a little more important contributor. If you're below it, a little less. The crucial point to make here is that, in fact, Skåne is one of the major contributors to Sweden's growth. And that is absolutely crucial. In fact, this covers more than just Sweden. As you can see, we've got Oxfordshire, Pas-de-Calais to show you where you sit among various intermediate regions in the OECD area. But you are actually one of the three major contributors to Sweden's growth. And it's always worth remembering because when you talk to your national policymakers, it's good to be able to remind them that what concerns Skåne is of significance for Sweden. These are not peculiarly local issues. This is a polycentric country, although Stockholm stands out, Västra Götaland is very important, Skåne is very important. When you slow, when you falter, it has ripple effects for Sweden. And that's always an important point. Having said that, although you're a very important contributor to Sweden's growth, you've not performed particularly spectacularly over the last decade, to be quite frank. If we look at Skåne's aggregate growth, we see basically that Skåne is most of the time a little bit below the national average, close to it, bumping above it in 2007 and then dropping back a bit, although again in 2009 you outperformed. But that has a lot to do with the fact, as we'll see, the crisis sort of came to Skåne early, and therefore the recovery also began a bit earlier than it did elsewhere. If we look at per capita growth, the picture is somewhat different because a lot of growth in Skåne is associated with rapidly increasing population. This is a growing region in terms of both population in absolute numbers and population share within Sweden. And so we see when we look at it on a per person basis, Skåne is sitting right around the average of Swedish regions in terms of its growth rate over the period. Although if we broke up 1995 to 2007, you would see distinct trends in different sub-periods. I have to acknowledge that that 12-year period conceals a lot. And you're, a bit below the Sweden average, although I suspect probably close to or above the average of Swedish regions, because the national average, as you can see on the graphic here, that vertical line is powerfully shaped by Stockholm, which does obviously have a skewing effect on the average. But putting you into an all OECD context gives us a somewhat more attractive picture. On the lower axis here, we have initial GDP per capita, converted at purchasing power parity levels. For those of you who don't know what that means, don't worry. It means we're taking account of the fact that a lot of things like land and housing and non-tradables have very different costs in different countries. So using market exchange rates can give you funny results. And on here we have GDP per capita growth over that 12-year period I was talking about. Now, if you look at this for just a moment, you'll realize the quadrant you want to be in is upper right, above average in terms of levels and above average in terms of growth. And in an OECD context, not only Skåne and Stockholm, but actually most Swedish regions are either in that upper right quadrant or relatively close to it, which is a reflection of Sweden's successful performance in the decade and a bit before the crisis. I mentioned the crisis hit Skåne early. The recovery also began a bit sooner than in many regions. Nonetheless, if we look at the cumulative change in real GDP per person, we see Skåne is one of the harder hit regions. Not as badly hit as Blekinge and some other places, but nonetheless more than a 6% drop in real GDP per capita over just a 2-year period, which is a fairly severe contraction. The labor market, about which we're going to say a lot more, and about which my colleague Emily Farkey will talk to you in a few minutes, the labor market is one of the areas where there was cause for some concern even before the crisis. As many of you know, Skåne tends to have relatively low employment rates compared to those of other Swedish regions. Now, that is even allowing for commuting across the bridge, right? We know that you have to adjust those numbers for the thousands of people who commute into Denmark every day. Nonetheless, this is a region with, by Swedish standards, relatively low employment rates over time. However, again, how you frame it is important. Low employment rates for Sweden, but actually relatively high by OECD standards, because Sweden as a country is one of the OECD members with relatively high levels of employment. Nonetheless, we see not only that Skåne's employment rate in 2007 was well below the average for Sweden, but we also see that Skåne is one of the regions which has seen quite a significant drop in employment levels over the period from 2007 to 2010. So the initial level was troubling. The impact of the crisis has made things tougher. We see this also in the data on unemployment. Personally, I find employment rates to be, for various reasons, the much more useful indicator. But we generally have data on unemployment that is a bit more recent. It tells us a little more what's going on close to the present. So here we have essentially the same picture, except using unemployment rates, which allows us to go through 2011. And we still see Skåne is, as it were, in the wrong quadrant, right? If on the growth quadrant you wanted to be in the upper right, here you definitely don't want to be in that lower left corner. And that is where Skåne is. So there is certainly a labor market challenge to be tackled. Having said that, one of the things that is impressive to us is if you look at the share of those who are out of work, who continue to seek employment, Skåne seems to be a region which has had relatively low levels of labor force withdrawal compared to many. And that's quite important. In other words, this is not all bad news. It means that people, one of the things we worry about when you have employment shocks is that lots of people simply give up and leave the labor force. And their skills atrophy, and over time it becomes harder and harder to reintegrate them. So it's extremely important, not just for Skåne, but across the OECD, that this huge labor market shock that we experienced in 2008, 9, 10 does not turn from dramatic kind of cyclical rise in unemployment into very long-term structural fall in employment rates because people have kind of given up hope and opted for early retirement or whatever. That's all I want to say about the past. If we look at the future, I think we can start by looking at the migration trends because they continue, and the projections we've seen suggest that Skåne will continue to see its population rising by 12,000 or so persons per year for the rest of this decade. And you see here, this is a mix of overseas and domestic immigrants, more people consistently coming, most of them quite young, than there are leaving. So you see the kind of net rise there. Now, it's good news, but it poses a challenge about which I want to speak for just a moment. the pattern here simply shows you where the immigrants are going in terms of the four corners of Skåne, and I think it'll be no surprise that the southwest corner around Malmö clearly has had the lion's share of these influxes and also felt the sharpest drop-off when the crisis hit. But our sense is that that really is an effect of the shock. All of the evidence we've seen points to continued significant levels of net inward migration. Now, what's the challenge? Well, the good news is, that many of these people are contributing to the growth that we talked about a minute ago. But typically, and you find this not only in Skåne, but in most places, where you have fairly large flows of immigration, most of the new arrivals tend to be less productive than the people who are already in place. So, large immigration flows are often associated with slower productivity growth, at least while they're occurring. That doesn't mean that this is bad news, because what matters is that the new arrivals are more productive at their point of arrival than they were wherever they came from, right? If those individuals are more productive in Skåne than they were wherever they were in the world or in the country before, this is good news for them, it's good news in aggregate. But the crucial point is what you want to do is to ensure that their productivity then rises and converges, right, with the higher levels of productivity of the more settled inhabitants of the region. Otherwise, you risk accumulating a kind of large population of low-skill, low-productivity workers in your economy. So the challenge is to integrate those immigrants, whether they come from elsewhere in Sweden or from abroad, in such a way as to ensure that they do not become that kind of pool of permanent low-skill, low-productivity labor, rather that their productivity begins to rise. There is also scope for increasing activity rates. I mentioned the relatively low levels of employment we see compared to other Swedish regions. I would again stress that if I put up all OECD regions, Skåne would look much better because these are high levels by the OECD. And Emily will talk about ways of increasing those activity rates, of drawing people into the labor market, helping to get the unemployed into work, helping to get those who've withdrawn back onto the market. But the real crucial challenge is above all about productivity. And that's a challenge not just for Skåne, but for Sweden. Sweden is a very high productivity economy, and it has to be. To sustain the Swedish model, which rests on relatively high wages, very high living standards, a very generous social safety net, requires high levels of activity and productivity to sustain it. And we can see over the very long period that relative to other economies, Sweden went through a period in which its comparative performance was sort of deteriorating. But what we see in the end is, since the crisis of the early 90s, Sweden has actually, as a country, held its own remarkably well. Now, that's not been the best period of productivity growth for any of these economies. Remember, this is comparative. This is comparative. This is looking at, relative to a moving average. So, in fact, some of that early period saw some healthier productivity growth. But nonetheless, what we see here is a high productivity economy that's been holding its own. And that's crucial. And it's crucial, to look at what underlies these things. And this shapes a lot of what we have to say in the review. First of all, you've got the question of labor utilization. If people aren't working, growth is going to be slow. Productivity levels for those who are working could be very high, but per capita they're going to be low. So obviously labor utilization is a first part of the equation. Getting people into work, helping those who have barriers to enter the labor market successfully is one of the key tasks. The other issue, though, is the productivity of that labor. And the productivity of that labor is ultimately a function of what economists call capital density or capital deepening. How much capital is employed? Are the workers at work being given very high-tech equipment, or are they trying to make microchips with hammers and tongs? The level of capital employed. And also what we call total factor productivity, which is that mysterious and elusive concept that economists apply to all of the things they really don't understand. Total factor productivity is a fancy term for our ignorance. because what it reflects is the fact that most growth in most economies, most of the time, we cannot account for in terms of increasing labor utilization or increasing capital investment. It has to come from increasing efficiency in the use of those two fundamental inputs. That could be better institutions, it could be better ways of organizing work, it could be forms of technological progress that we're not very good at measuring. There's all kinds of things. It's a wonderful black box, but it's actually a vital black box. And what a fairly large body of literature points to as the kind of underlying drivers of productivity are investment, both private investment in terms of ensuring where necessary that capital deepening is taking place, public investment for adequate infrastructure, and so on, innovation, skills. Clearly, the skills of the workforce are crucial. We'll talk about that. Entrepreneurship, and really being able to have an economy that is dynamic enough to generate new sectors, new activities as opportunities arise, rather than betting that you can always get by just doing a bit more this year of what you used to do last year. And finally, competition. Now, competition, to be honest, is the one of these things that the literature is most equivocal on. And it also happens to be an area of policy that is very much in the remit of the national government and the European Union as far as Sweden is concerned. So we actually have relatively little to say about competition in Skåne. But these other four are all important dimensions of what's discussed in the review. So as you read it, I kind of wish we'd set it out this way on page 1 perhaps. We didn't. But as you read the review, bear in mind that underlying it all is this understanding that the challenge is to ensure strong and sustained productivity growth in the region. Skåne is underperforming in terms of productivity. If you look at this GDP per worker relative to the national average, now the national average, remember, is actually rising. There's a horizontal line there at 100%. That doesn't mean that Skåne is not experiencing productivity growth. As you can see in the right-hand column, Skåne's productivity has been rising at almost 4% per year. I didn't put the dates on there, but I think it's 1995 to 2007, as are so many of the graphics I'm showing you. We kind of cut off before the crisis because the crisis disrupted so much of what was happening. But then the productivity graphic here does go further. Now, the point is, Skåne's productivity has been growing, but it's not converging with Sweden's average, and it's not a spectacular performance compared to other Swedish regions. Now, part of that has to do with structural change, because there's two things that can affect productivity. One is whether or not people are getting more efficient and more productive at doing whatever it is they're doing. The other is changes in the activities that people are undertaking. Right? If people are moving out of low productivity activities and employment in higher productivity activities is increasing, that's good news. Right? So you have both growth within sectors and you have a kind of composition of the economy effect. Right? And that's important because the changing composition of Skåne's economy has some interesting effects, and they're very difficult to tease out. I couldn't tell you for certain whether the changing composition of the Skåne economy is good news for productivity. I think it probably is, but it also presents a challenge, and you'll see why in a minute. What's been happening is manufacturing, mining, and utilities, mainly manufacturing, of course, has seen declining employment shares over time. Skåne is changing its specialization out of manufacturing, in contrast to, say, your neighbors to the north in Västra Götaland. And you're seeing increased concentration in particular in trade, hospitality, transport and communications, and financial intermediation. Now, so it's a move from manufacturing to services. The reason it's hard to say what the level effects of that are is that some of those services, like financial services, are very high value, high productivity, and very export-oriented, in fact. Others of them are in sectors characterized by lower skills, lower productivity, and they tend to be proximity services like retail trade rather than tradables. So it's a sort of bifurcation there into two different sets of services. This, by the way, is relative specialization. This is where you are moving relative to the Swedish economy. The Swedish economy as a whole is also moving that way. Like all OECD economies, we've seen a gradual reduction in the manufacturing share. But if we look at the productivity growth rates, right, so the composition effect is ambiguous, but probably, I think, a little bit positive because of that concentration in high-value services that's been emerging. The trouble is with the other half. I said, productivity depends part on what people are doing, what the composition of the economy is, and then on whether or not they're doing it more productively from year to year. If we look at the sectoral productivity growth rates, we see in mining and manufacturing, Skåne still has a respectable rate of productivity growth. Employment in the sectors is falling, but productivity continues to grow. It does much less well, though, in those proximity services I was talking about, those low-value, low-skill services. Whereas in finance and business services, where there has been a lot of growth, we also see that Skåne has comparatively high productivity rates. So that's actually good news, right? You're increasingly specialized in an area where your performance within Sweden is near the top. Everybody's with me. I wouldn't worry too much about construction because it's a relatively small sector, especially at the moment in most countries. But here's the hitch. Now look closely at the very different scales on these graphics, because the graphics all look alike, but the scales differ. And what you see is that mining and manufacturing, which you're moving out of, that's a sector which is typically characterized by fairly high rates of productivity growth. Right? Even in manufacturing, Skåne has been growing at somewhat over 4% per year on these numbers. Whereas in trade, hospitality, and communications, it's somewhat under 4%. And when we come over to financial services, very high-value activities, good thing to be in, but characterized by low levels of productivity growth overall. Skåne is near the top of the league table, and yet productivity in the sector is growing by just over 2% per year. So one of the challenges is that your specialization is moving you into sectors where you may have a greater comparative advantage, so that's appropriate, where the composition effect is helpful, so that's good news, but where sustaining productivity growth may prove to be harder over time. It's harder to raise output per worker in these sectors. Coming now to enterprise, another of the key drivers that I mentioned. Skåne looks pretty good in terms of enterprise creation. Now, strictly speaking, what we ought to do is to adjust this for population densities. The fact of the matter is that large cities are richer ecosystems for small firms. It's easier to start, other things being equal, it's easier to start a small business in a big city than it is in a small rural town. So to some extent, we would expect Skåne to be near the top as one of Sweden's larger, denser regions. Nonetheless, you're quite close to Stockholm, which is much denser. You're ahead of Uppsala, which is basically Stockholm suburb, as you know. You're well ahead of your neighbors. It's always nice to be able to tell you when you're doing better than Västra Götaland. That always makes us popular here. So this is pretty good news. And the other thing that's quite striking, though, is that your startups tend to be small. Now, this is something we really wanted to study in depth, and we searched. Emily, in particular, spent a lot of time with micro databases to see whether we could find the data, really to see what happens to startup firms in Skåne. What we heard here quite a lot was about the difficulties of growing up businesses and the degree to which many of these small startups, particularly the innovative ones, get started and then they're bought, often by bigger companies which may well move activities elsewhere. And we even heard reference in our first mission to what someone called the Valley of Death, which was the middle range of business size, right? You get a small business going, you're fine, but to grow that small business up, you have to pass through enormous difficulties. And that obviously is quite important, because if you want new sectors to take root here and new activities, it has to be an environment that is more favorable to growing up these businesses. Emily will have more to say, by the way, about this in the labor market chapter, because there are also some interesting patterns to do with the human capital side of it and who is starting businesses in Skåne. I mentioned skills as a crucial driver, and this is becoming one of my kind of pet themes. If we look at tertiary education, actually you are less well off than Stockholm. This is for South Sweden, by the way. This includes Skåne and also Blekinge. So if you don't like what you see, you can just explain that that's all to do with problems in Blekinge. That if this were Skåne alone, you would be right at the top of the chart. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of tertiary education, you do quite well. And across the board, all of Sweden does very well compared to the OECD average. I mean, this is a country with highly educated workforce. Having said that, if we look at the proportion of the workforce, which has only a basic education, kind of compulsory or elementary basic education, we see that in South Sweden it is actually substantially higher than in Stockholm and a little bit higher also than it is in Sweden as a whole. It still looks good compared to that OECD average, which is very high indeed. But it's very important to dwell on this for a moment, because one of the things that I spent a lot of the spring working with colleagues on is a lot of modeling of regional growth across the whole of the OECD area. And I could, open up my laptop and show you 20-odd pages of tables of regression results. And we use two human capital variables, which are essentially correspond to these. We use one which looks at the share of the workforce with tertiary qualifications, and we use another that looks at the share of the workforce with only compulsory education. The variable that performs consistently best in pretty much every model with every specification across the board is both perform well, both are important, but the one that really performs is the low education variable. In other words, it is quite clear that the drag effect of having a larger population of very low-skilled individuals is a very significant negative factor, and maybe a more important factor determining performance than having a somewhat larger share of tertiary educated. Right? The trouble is, policymakers across the OECD love higher education. And they love to expand universities and push more people through. But neglecting the needs further down the skill spectrum can be fatal. For one thing, to create appropriate opportunities for your high-skilled workforce, you often need them to be working in complex organization where there are other people with different kinds of skills. Right? And we saw this when Emily was involved as well. We worked on Chicago in the US last year. And in Chicago, they were obsessed with higher education and high skills. Well, Chicago, you can hardly walk 3 blocks in Chicago without passing a world-class educational institution. But what Chicago has going against it is not a lack of ability to produce very high skills, but big problems further down the skill spectrum, large population of people with very low or no skills. And that's really the challenge that, in our view, they needed to be confronting. So I dwell on this. I don't want to make basic education or vocational skills and so on sound like the silver bullet, right, that will solve all your problems. Because you can equip those people with skills, and if there are not job opportunities for them, if there are other barriers to growth, you won't get a result. But it is vital, and it's often neglected by policymakers across the OECD with that focus on the high end. And it's worth stressing here in Skåne, because so much of Skåne's ambition is tied up at the high end of the skills market. This is, and very appropriately is, a region with a lot of emphasis on innovation, high-tech, knowledge-intensive services. We certainly wouldn't challenge that. It's very important, and it's where Skåne has tremendous strength. But there's a danger of a kind of bifurcation in the labor market, because one of the things that's happening as a result of immigration is also increasing challenges with people who either have low skills, or they don't have the right skills, or they have skills that are not being recognized and fully exploited. And it's important to recognize that even as you aim high, it doesn't pay to only focus on the kind of top end, whether it's education or innovation or any other sphere. This is just a slide which kind of is meant to show you how the rest of the survey fits together, looking at, I've already talked about productivity and employment, which is very much the focus of Chapter 1. That's picked up actually in Chapter 3 on human capital and labor markets. We do look at innovation, entrepreneurship, trying to cover the growth drivers. And then finally, Chapter 4, really looking at quality of life issues. As you'll see when we get to Chapter 4, it's one of the more agreeable chapters to read if you come from Skåne, because a lot of what's in there is quite positive. And many of the things we write about are not to tell you what you're doing wrong and should do differently, but actually to explain to people outside Skåne who look at this review what their regions might learn from some of the more successful things that happen here. And that's very much around this idea of developing a smart and healthy region. Although I think, really to establish that brand, Skåne needs to figure out a way to sell Absolut as the healthiest vodka on the market. You certainly don't want to give it up, but it may be an odd fit with a healthy region brand. The last thing I want to do is to talk about two big projects, Max 4 and ESS. I could choose other examples, but these seem to me to be particularly appropriate, just to illustrate the way the pieces fit together. And then you'll be thrilled to know I'm done. We know the region is banking heavily on these two very large investments in some very impressive R&D infrastructure. That's great, but let's be very clear. The benefits of those investments will not automatically land in Skåne. These things are big, and precisely because they're so big, they're more than local. And if you want to get the best value out of them here in Skåne, bring the benefits to the region, there's some things that need to be addressed. First of all, I talked about labor markets and the skills base. The fact of the matter is, I would bet you all the Swedish crowns in my pocket, not such a heavy bet, I'd even bet you the euros, that large numbers of the top-tier research jobs in these facilities are not going to go to locals. And that's fine. These are international caliber facilities. These are fields in which there's an international talent pool and market, and that's what you want to attract. But there are going to be a lot of other jobs to fill further down the skill chain. And I don't simply mean secretaries and janitors. On the contrary, I mean lab technicians, engineers, real jobs with real skills that lead people into serious careers that nonetheless are not going to be recruiting graduates of MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? Or people from, the University of Sydney in Australia. These are skills that, if you're in a position to meet the demand here, will actually create a lot of employment, significant employment here in Skåne. But it's important to be aware of that's the level of the skill spectrum. I was in two federal laboratories in the United States, in the state of Tennessee, one in Memphis and one in Oak Ridge, which is, imagine, this is the largest Department of Energy laboratory in the United States. It's actually where the first controlled nuclear fission occurred during the Second World War. And because of the war, it was deliberately built in the middle of nowhere. Imagine the biggest physics laboratory in Europe being built in Älmhult. Okay? All of the top research staff are from somewhere else. There and in Memphis. All of the top research staff came to those jobs from elsewhere. But everywhere we went in those laboratories, we were meeting with technicians, engineers, people below that kind of top-tier researchers who were supporting that in very important ways, who had been formed locally. And both ends of the state of Tennessee, around Oak Ridge and Knoxville, and at the other end around Memphis, there were very deliberate programs in place to ensure that they could provide the skills that those facilities needed. So that's labor markets. If you want to talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, I should have put entrepreneurship as well. You want a business environment. That means that when you have spin-offs from these activities, when you have small high-tech startups, people don't get a great idea, develop it to a certain level, patent the idea, and flog it to some big multinational elsewhere, but where actually at least some of those ideas, some of them will always move. It'll be more efficient to produce them elsewhere, that's fine. but where you've created an environment where some of those spin-offs take root in the region and begin to form new activities in Skåne. So if you want to get the most out of Max 4 and ESS, you need to get your labor market and training arrangements right. You need to address your innovation and also your entrepreneurship systems, and you need to address these questions of quality of life. You're going to be attracting a lot of top talent to ESS. You want these people and their spouses to find the schools and the job opportunities and the quality of life in Skåne that prompts them to settle on this side of that great big bridge, rather than deciding that they would rather live in Copenhagen, which is, let's face it, one of the options that some of them will consider. So, I use this just as an illustration of the way these things fit together. There are others one could think about, because in all of these things, it's important to realize that you have to think about your development strategies very much as a package and how the pieces fit together, rather than one problem at a time without necessarily realizing that as we resolve this problem here, we're creating a new problem there. And having said all that, I wish you every success with having a productive discussion of our findings and sifting, debating, picking up on the ones you find most useful and taking them forward. Thanks very much.
One thing that you mentioned that is important is productivity, and that Skåne is underperforming in terms of productivity. And I might not be the smartest guy in this room, but I still need a little bit more explanation of what that actually means. How you measure productivity. I mean, what does it really mean that Skåne is underperforming in terms of productivity?
Well, productivity there's a number of measures. The simplest is labor productivity. It's output per worker.
Output, how much output every worker represents money-wise?
Yeah, how much output each worker is producing, how much value added each worker generates. Now, because ultimately your output depends on two things: how many people are working and how much.
That's usually something that I ask when I come to debate. How many work here? They say some 75%.
How many of them are how many people are working and how much, and how effectively are they working? Although Skåne's employment rates are relatively low by Swedish standards, and we see, and there are particular groups with real labor market barriers whose involvement could be raised. So there is room to raise employment levels, activation rates as we would call them, get people into the labor market working. The real challenge for Skåne, already having fairly high employment rates, is to ensure that productivity, that value added per worker is rising from year to year. And that's where Skåne's been, again, underperforming in a Swedish context. And I want to stress that because this is an economy which has not only got high levels of productivity, but it has had healthy productivity growth.
Yeah, but by
OECD standards. But within your neighborhood,
we need to compare with other Swedish regions.
Within your neighborhood, you've not been doing so well. And that's partly the migration effect. Let's be clear, right? If we screened out newcomers, we might well find that the picture looked very different. And as I said, the migration into Skåne is good news, but it's only going to be good news for the long term if then those people are integrated into the labor market, their skills are raised, and so on. So it's partly a side effect of the migration, of course.
So migration is the most important factor in explaining the low productivity?
I don't know that it's the most important factor, but it clearly is an important factor.
Okay. Anything on this? And then I also needed a little bit more explanation on what you just mentioned on the ESS and Max. Here's the picture. I've read in your review that there is a risk that Skåne is not able to, I think, capitalize fully. I mean, really take advantage of this. And one risk is not attracting the most talented people. And another, and please explain again, what was the other part? That we don't have enough people in the lower sector.
Well, that you have that you need to be, really ensure that you've got programs in place to form the kinds of skills that are needed to fill all of those really very important research support positions. I was just really struck by this. It was on my mind in part because, as I say, in this trip to Tennessee, we visited two major federal laboratories. And in both cases, the federal government wasn't responsible for training these people, and it wasn't recruiting them from around. I mean, it was the local authorities who had recognized the need to link up with universities and other institutes to provide programs that would train the people that were needed to take these jobs and do them well.
But we have plenty of universities.
Yeah.
And
No,
so
the-
do you see that there is a lack of people with university?
No, I have not looked closely enough at I'll be honest, I haven't looked closely enough at the preparations that are being made for that kind of formation in conjunction with the coming of these institutions. So, this isn't even intended so much as a criticism as an illustration of the way in which these things need to be fit together.
And
to
they
make
are
the whole
all
thing,
necessary.
to make the whole thing work.
Yeah.
So don't take what I'm saying about skills here as a necessary criticism, but rather as simply underlying the kind of interaction among policy streams that you need to make sure all the pieces are in place to get the most out of these large investments.
Yeah, because you're fooling yourself if you're just focusing on trying to get the best brains from China or San Francisco. Okay, should we continue with the next chapter in your review? That's Claire Novellaire.